Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Open Source in Business, a podcast or speaker series or interview series, however you want to call it, where I talk to experts in the field of open source and how open source brings value to the business world beyond some of the topics that we explore more regularly. So today I'm joined by Celeste Horgan, who is a staff technical writer at the CNCF, and by Anne Gentle, who's Developer Experience Manager at Cisco DevNet. Welcome. Thank you for joining me.
Great. Glad to be here. And you just downed a cup of coffee before we started. That was impressive.
I did. Yeah, that was shot size. That was the remainder of my espresso. And so we're going to talk about the value of documentation because both of you are experts in the field of technical documentation as it pertains to open source. And I know you've been working on this field for a long time. And Celeste, you've been with the CNCF for several years at this point?
Just a couple of, actually. I'll be at my 2-year anniversary in December. But I've been doing documentation for, I think, closer to 7 or 8 years now. I don't keep track.
Okay. And Anne, you've written a couple of books on the topic of documentation in open source. There's Conversation and Community, which is the first book that I read that really spoke to the specific nature of documentation in open source projects. And your latest book is, remind me of the title?
Code.
Docs like code. Okay.
Yeah, and that's more about how to collaborate with, like version control, like Git, and using, continuous integration, continuous deployment for docs.
So managing documentation right alongside your code with the same workflows.
Exactly, and it's very
and it's being very humble. Yeah. Oh. And is being very humble, which is in the world of technical documentation. This is a well-known, well-loved book, which has changed many minds and shifted the field in this particular direction. So I'm personally happy to be here talking to Anne.
I wouldn't have it without open source. I mean, OpenStack was the one setting up this amazing tool chain and this amazing group that was very collaborative. So, I think the book is out of open source. And my whole career is a trajectory thanks to open source. If I hadn't had a chance to kind of experiment with wikis because open source was using wikis, I wouldn't have written the first book, And so I just, it's a way to experiment with, we can be cutting edge in open source and try things. And, I think that's really relevant to business today too. Like, try it out, see what happens.
Yeah. I mean, I feel the same about open source as a writer. I think, so my boss, Chris Anischik, is like encouraging me to give this talk at Write the Talks. And I keep telling him, Chris, I'm scared because it's not going to be a talk. It's going to be an angry rant. And I don't know if I want to be that person like right out the gate, but you may see it. And the talk is basically how like technical writers don't have a career ladder. We don't progress very well because we tend to work in these very isolated settings where we're the only writer on the team, we're the only writer on a small team. And I feel exactly the same about open source for that same reason. Like it has given me exposure to talking on podcasts as an expert. It's given me exposure to doing media. It's given me exposure to like leadership skills and opportunities that technical writers don't typically have. It's made me significantly more valuable to the recruiters kind of like polluting my inbox on LinkedIn. I say that kindly. It's very flattering, actually. But
it's better than the opposite.
It's better than the opposite. It's true. But it's increasing the leadership abilities and the expertise of your technical writing staff is very hard to do in isolation, and it's very easy to do in open source. In my opinion.
I'd love to talk a lot more about that later, because I know we talked about it a little before we came on camera, of the role of soft skills in being successful in an open source project, and it's definitely something I want to dig into. But let me start by asking you both, right? Clearly, documentation is one of the fundamental differentiators between successful and unsuccessful projects. Projects with good documentation get broader adoption. And their users are happier with that, with those projects than projects that don't have it. And yet, time after time on surveys around open source projects, we see that documentation, the lack of documentation or the lack of good documentation, is one of the biggest criticisms or biggest needs of a project. So why is there this disconnect between the importance of documentation for project success and the relatively late investment in documentation that happens by the people who are building these open source projects? Do you want to have a go at that first, Celeste, from your perspective?
Ooh, so I mean, the way I always explain this to developers, whether I'm working in open source or working kind of like in a private company, is when you're choosing a new language to work with, or when you're choosing a framework or a library that you want to incorporate to help out the thing you're trying to build, because your product manager has told you that's what you're building today, how do you choose? And the developers often go like, well, I take a look to see what it can do, and if it can do the thing that I hope it can do, and I say, okay, so where do you go to look for that information? And invariably then they go, oh, I mean, I look at the documentation. I look to see if the documentation describes the thing I'm trying to do close enough. So I'm like, okay, so when you choose a new project, you're choosing based on the documentation. And if it doesn't have the documentation, you can't choose it. And then it clicks in their little heads. Sort of, I say that's a little derogatory, I apologize. It clicks in their heads and they go like, oh, yeah, I guess I do need to write this, or else nobody's going to use my project. And I go, yeah.
Right.
I think there's a lot of like focus on, particularly in open source. I think there's an attitude of like, if you're not committing code, you're like a less valuable member of the project. And I think that extends just from like tech culture back all the way to the 80s probably. But when you think about how people actually interact, particularly with open source, where there isn't a support organization that you can pay into to get that kind of information, the documentation becomes extremely valuable. So,
okay. Anne, have you seen like the projects that are successful in getting early stage investment in docs, and what kind of, is that typically led from the top down, or is it like just the fact that the developers are conscious this is important?
Well, I think you said a keyword there with investment, right? I mean, you do. The thing about docs is it's actually difficult, and you kind of have to sit your butt in a seat and write. And that is a really difficult concept a lot of times for people to just understand the sheer magnitude of the work. So investment means, okay, how can we make this sustainable? It's paying someone to do it, probably, and then making sure that person is empowered with equality in the community, right? A doc's contribution is the same as a dev contribution. And that's a big deal too, right? It's just put everyone on the same playing field, probably the same tools. Like that, let's be real, that's why Docs Like Code really appeals to me, is like, hey, I can get help from devs, and guess what? Devs can help with the documentation too. So, that's
Right.
That's a big deal. And it it just breaks down silos. It's not any kind of, throw it over the wall. That's the kind of thing you want. And so I think, like, to the first question, why? It's because it's hard. But anytime you look at something that's difficult, you also have to look at like, well, does the person even know how to do it? And I think there's a little bit of just uncertainty as well. How do I get started with docs? You could spend 6 months just evaluating tool chains, because that's the fun part, right? So there's just a lot of like, it's just hard to find this like sustainability, I think, is what I keep coming back to, right? And hey, even if you didn't get it early on, it's always a good time to start, and it's always a good time to revisit, right? Your docs and test them and get people in front of them and reinvigorate. There's always a chance to do that. So, but I don't know if I answered your second question.
Well, so let me put it this way. When is the best time for a technical writer to get involved in a project? Is it before any code is written, so that you're writing like what Celeste mentioned before we came on camera, of documentation-driven development, where you write the docs to describe the behavior that the user should see and then have developers code to that? Or I mean, the more common pattern is that you get involved once there is something that exists, and you're kind of trying to, I guess, I don't know what the right question is, but like there's this early stage work, which is part design, part product marketing, and part technical documentation. And which is the most, like, which do you typically attack first, I guess?
Can I give you a spicy answer to your question? Can I get controversial?
Ask away. Yeah.
So I think that software as a field struggles with, I think it struggles with its hidden creativity. And I think when you look at developers as a group of people, so I went to art school, my degree's in design. And I just got into this because I'm a nerd. So the thing that always strikes me when I step into like a new team of software developers is that it's such a creative way of working. It's so just like deeply, deeply creative. It is as creative as any art studio I've ever been in. But I think developers are a bit in denial about that. And I think when you look at modern software practices, and I include Agile in this statement, I think it's trying to sort of mask creativity, for lack of a better word. And I think when you look at documentation, I think when you look at QA and like automated testing, and I think when you look at CI/CD as practices, that's really funny because those are all so regimented comparatively. Like documentation cares very much about what is the truth of the system. Test-driven development also cares very much about what is the truth of the system. And to a certain extent, CI/CD pipelines are kind of in that same realm. And so I think like inherently, for example, writing the documentation before you actually start developing makes a lot of sense. And I think people understand it makes sense. I think it's the same with test-driven development. It's like you have to outline the boundaries of the system before you can understand how it's supposed to perform. Right. But I think that like the people who actually go into software development and are very passionate about it are actually like deeply creative and a bit like loosey-goosey, for lack of a better word. And so they rebel against it because it's a very regimented way of working, which I completely understand, but just embrace the creativity and then work around it in a different way.
Right. And I mean, I that's kind of what Agile does, like 2-week sprints, all this discipline of daily stand-ups, and so that it's almost like you hear waterfall is the, regimented way. And it's like you do Agile really, really in a dedicated way.
Right.
It's super,
yeah.
Lots of rails in place. Right. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's like the difference between, planned cities where you have like the Le Corbusier idea of the garden city with the green belts, and then you've got the Jane Jacobs kind of neighborhoods growing organically, or Christopher Alexander neighborhoods growing organically, and you plan around interconnections between them, and you kind of you try and make sure that each neighborhood is its own autonomous cell. And I feel like it's almost the monolithic development versus microservice development, or waterfall versus agile. It's like
well, an API design, like there's really great rigid specifications, right? And those have evolved over time. But if you can have someone who's really into words and really into user experience and developer experience, get a look at that design early, they're going to recognize, especially if there's 2 or more teams working on something, like, hey, they have a login as well as you. Who gets the actual word login? There's a lot of like precious commodity in the actual words people get to use. So someone, it doesn't even have to be a tech writer. Now the tech writers are going to be good at it, right? But in API design, anybody who's just a good word nerd, anybody who's just a good recognizer of detailed patterns, and someone who can just advocate for the user, like, look, no user is going to know what you mean when you say that. Can you, let's try to rephrase, or
but I think sort of like moving I think moving documentation sort of up to the left, if you will, in the process. I think there's also sort of like that hierarchy comes into play again of like, the most important people in the room are the software developers, and the marketers or the technical writers or the QA people or the support people, well, like they're downstream. So we don't consider them early in the process. And I think that's a very like dangerous way of existing. Like the more diverse opinions you have in the room and the more you're able to equalize those opinions, the more complete the design of anything you're going to do is going to be. The less, the less rakes you're going to step on if you have more people to look for rakes. But it's a hard sell for some people in this field.
Okay. So do you find yourself, when you're joining a project for the first time, do you find yourself writing more or editing more? Like, I imagine as a technical writer that like you're not necessarily an expert in the project that you're working on, certainly not the first day you start working on it. So do you, like, is your first job, well, let me try and install this, let me figure out how to use it, let me figure out where all of the rakes are, as you were saying, or is it, I'm going to spend all this time talking to the developers so that I know what they're trying to do, and then I'll write what they tell me? What would you say is your best approach, first approach?
Well, and there's a great talk. So the Write the Docs community is this wonderful community of developers and writers who work really hard on making open source documentation better. And here's the thing: a lot of people want to figure out, well, how do I approach an open source project? And I really want to work on one, but I don't know how to get started. And so there's this great talk, and we can put it in the show notes, by Abigail McCarthy. But it's like, she's like, why don't you pick some goals for why you want to contribute? And then, does the culture match for the goals of the project you're looking for? Because then you're going to be a lot more motivated if you kind of picked your why, like, why am I even working on this, And so it make sure that matches up for sure, because culture is so important in open source. It's a very people-powered environment, shall we say, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and I mean, in my personal way would be looking at their bug backlog. Like, I love to check boxes. That's one of my favorite things, so I just personally know where my approach would be. And then I'm trying things out, right? I'm like, does it actually run? Do I need to log a bug? So yeah, that's my approach. But I love this talk. Definitely highly recommend.
Yeah, there's the CNCF community is a bit of a unique one because it's so many projects large. I think Priyanka gave a count at KubeCon a couple weeks ago. I think we're at 144 projects now, and there are 3 paid writers, 3 to 4 of us, which is a lot of project and not a lot of writer. So at the CNCF, the approach we're taking is a lot more editing based, just because we have to spread ourselves somehow. It's not the ideal approach, I think, for a lot of writers. And I think that's actually where a lot of the disconnect for writers getting involved in open source comes in, is when you're working kind of in a private company as a writer, you're often pairing very closely with a product team. Like, you're attending their stand-ups, you're looking at their sprints, you're looking at the tickets as they move across the board, and you're saying, that one, that one, that one, that one. Okay, you 5 developers, let me throw you into a room and let's talk. Let's talk about the docs. We don't necessarily have that luxury in the CNCF ecosystem, so it is a lot more editing based for that reason. But yeah, I think there's a disconnect between how writers typically work and how open source works, where there's like this super high level of autonomy for developers that I do not know the solution for. But one of the things on my plate is to attempt a solution for, and I'll let you know how it goes.
I'm curious, you mentioned there's 3 people paid to work on docs. Is that across the entire CNCF ecosystem, or is that specifically by the CNCF itself?
That is people who are directly employed by the CNCF in some manner,
so
including
do you have
myself.
people working on technical docs who are part of the member ecosystem as well?
Yes, but they're not necessarily technical writers. Sometimes they're very senior developers. Sometimes they're DevRel, and their sort of scope of work also includes community management. It also includes their code of conduct. It also includes like CI/CD pipeline management. We do have a couple of dedicated technical writers, and I think they floated off. They were from Amazon, and I think they floated off to OpenTelemetry at some point, but I haven't heard from them in a while. it's hard to sort of keep technical writers around. Like one of the struggles we have as an ecosystem is like how do you pair writers with projects? And a part of how we're trying to solve that is like how do you help a project get ready for a writer? Because a lot of projects aren't ready just yet. They're not quite organized, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, the reason I asked is because I think one of the things that I've seen Anne do and I don't know whether this was deliberate or what. I think it was deliberate, but I don't know whether it was deliberate or whether it was incidental. When you were leading the documentation efforts for OpenStack was to really spend a lot of time on community management almost for documentation and like making sure you were connected to all of the people who were working on docs.
Yeah. And I mean, the hardest part right now would be 18 months of COVID. I mean, I was able to have in-person sprints. We got to know each other. It has to be even harder when it's remote as well. But I mean, and the thing is, like in Cisco DevNet, I have a Docs Code CI/CD system where we're enabling almost 2,000 people within Cisco. So it is very similar to that coordination effort. I have a very tiny but mighty team that's centralized, that is bringing in all of these developer docs, right? So there's these kind of like triage, prioritize, find small bits of work that people can do and the amount of time they have. Sometimes you only get somebody for 6 months. Well, what work can they do? We use checklists. There's just a lot of like content governance that you end up doing. What's even a product goes end of support or end of life or end of sale. So we're looking, and honestly, I'm looking for more ways to automate it all the time. Right? Give me an API. Any API will help. But yeah, it's just sort of the business of any incremental pieces of work, I think. And you're going to find it. You'd find it in QA. You'd find it in, dev backlogs as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how you justify adding a writer to a project, because I imagine, at some point somebody hires somebody, right, and they realize that the money that it's going to cost to pay somebody to work full time on documentation is going to be worthwhile. So how do you what types of measures do you use to measure like how effective you're being or the value you're bringing to a project? And have you ever had to put together a business case for hiring a new person or convincing somebody to hire you for a project?
I mean, the luxury of my current sort of role in our current team is that somebody else makes the business case for us, and it's usually the projects themselves or the board. And that's actually how my position was created. Was the project said, we want a writer, and so a writer was found. So this is actually something that I think the CNCF can maybe work on, or that I think needs to be worked on, is right now there's a bit of a disconnect between the Technical Oversight Committee approving projects to be in the CNCF and the CNCF's ability as staff to scale to that. Which is the more projects you approve, in theory, somehow those services need to scale. And automation will take you so far, but there comes a point where you just need headcount. And writing, for lack of a better way of doing it, is a manual process. It is a person process. So at some point you do need headcount for writing. And so I think that's kind of like the next frontier, is how do you define the scalability model for an organization like the CNCF, where it's like, as X number of projects exist, Y number of services exist.
Yeah. And I've done it recently with, talking about a small but mighty team. I actually started measuring capacity. This is how many teams we can help publish. This is how many new docs we brought on board. This is how many we updated. And we would give it like a small, medium, large. So you do a 1, 2, 3, you get out your spreadsheets, you figure out your capacity, But I mean, metrics wise, you can do it a couple ways with like how many support tickets were actually not, there's a lot of companies have, how much does each support ticket cost you? Did I not have to hire a support engineer because the docs deflected that, I think that especially for developer documentation, it's going to be fairly easy to like figure out adoption. And man, if you have interactive docs where they're actually able to do API calls and you can tie in, how many API calls they're doing or how many like practice keys or developer keys people came and got from your docs. Like, you're going to find a lot of really good metrics just for, that's your pirate metrics, the adoption rate, the,
right.
How much are they getting involved, because that should let you have a metrics flow that says, hey, this doc got people to try it, got people to do something, right?
In the CNCF ecosystem, I would say the metric is probably more around like how projects are moving through that graduation cycle. And because docs is a huge part of the evaluation for that, like the two big pieces are like kind of how diverse is your contributor base, how many companies do you have contributing, and sort of how, reasonably speaking, how polished is your website and your docs. How complete are they? Do you have like case studies from end user companies? That kind of thing.
Nice.
So that's kind of our metric of choice is the work we're doing directly leading to sort of more projects getting closer to incubating from sandbox or graduating from incubating. The interesting thing about documentation in regards, because what Anne is describing, I think, are like traditional documentation metrics of success. Like, did we deflect a support ticket? Is there high interaction in the docs? Like, are we publishing lots of docs? Do we feel like we have high completion? Aside from the completion piece, you don't really have access to the other two, which are actually very important for documentation groups. You have no idea how many support tickets have been deflected because there is no support organization in open source, right? There is no formal support organization anyways. And you have you have an idea of like how many people are sort of interacting with stuff. But you have no idea.
I remember,
sorry.
I had a fun time grepping through IRC logs at one point, and I was looking for getting started and install. Like just to see,
I was going to say Slack is kind of like your support portal, insofar as the project is concerned.
Really
I think when you look at, I think when you look at something like Kubernetes, where you have large organizations like VMware or like Red Hat who are heavily investing in sort of managed Kubernetes distributions, that's a slightly different metric. And I actually wonder if there is a metric you could derive around like how many of these sort of like managed distributions exist around a particular project, which is indicative of its success and indicative of the fact that companies feel they can build out and finance these teams because their people can find the answers in your docs. But that's a bit fuzzy.
Yeah, it's interesting to get that, like the dichotomy of like maturity-based or completion-based metrics versus, business value-based metrics. And yeah, it's interesting to like, you're right. In a lot of open source projects, we just don't have access to the kind of even just adoption metrics and whether people are. And I guess there's the user surveys that all of the projects we're involved in do, where we can see, oh, documentation went down this year. Cool. Fewer people are complaining about it. But
and I was going to say, the opposite can happen too, where if your docs do start to get complained about, that then that lets you act, hopefully, right, to justify addition. Right. But because I do remember, the OpenStack board was very supportive when there were just tons of complaints about install.
Right.
So I had a contract writer. It was a good reaction. So it's also just measuring when things are really tanking.
Yeah, it does sometimes feel like post-processing though. It's like, yes, we're we're calling in
lagging.
We're calling in the doctor when somebody is on their deathbed type thing. It's probably not.
I mean, that's always the issue. That's kind of always the issue with docs, right? And as you and I were talking, Dave, before we got on the call, I think most places tend to underinvest in documentation, and there's a few sort of key types of businesses that don't. And I think the exemplary type of business that typically invests well in documentation is a software as a service API. So Stripe or Twilio,
API
business
first.
models like that, where the product is the API, it's closed source. You have no idea what you're getting back except that API call, meaning the documentation is the interface to the API. And these companies tend to typically realize that, and they invest very heavily in their documentation. However, again, as we were saying before Anne joined us, they seem to also go through cycles because documentation is viewed as a cost center rather than as product development. And this is the key problem where you see, Stripe had a kind of great 5 or 10 year start, 5 year, we'll say, it's not that old. They had a kind of great first 5 years with their documentation, like incredibly fabulous. They had this rock star team. It went to seed for 3 or 4 years, and now they're investing heavily in documentation again because they realized their documentation is not looking as good as it used to. And I remember diving into those docs 2 or 3 years ago with a new manager of mine, and as what I thought would be a positive example, and then going like, oh, things have changed. And now they're investing they're starting to invest very heavily in their writing teams again because they realize it's the interface. And again, I think there is a fundamental attitude problem around documentation in most businesses. And it's the idea of it's support, it's a cost center, we have to do it at some point, whatever, here you go. And that's not what it is. It is a key member of a product development team. And if you treat it like that, you will have greater success.
It's one of the things that Kathy Sierra has written extensively about. It's the idea that, you get the glossy brochure before you buy the product, and then you buy like we were talking about SLR cameras, you buy the SLR camera and the manual is kind of this drab, like this. It's like text and buttons, and you're like, I don't know how to work this thing. I can't figure out how to make it autofocus or whatever. And the difference between before and after is kind of stark.
Yeah.
And to that point, I mean, you mentioned user case studies, right? And you mentioned wikis earlier. The potential scope for a technical writer in a project is so broad. You could end up doing product marketing or sales enablement docs. Or maintaining the website copy, maintaining user case studies. Where do you limit yourself? What types of things do you focus on? Like at what point do you say this is not my job anymore? The website's not my job. There's a web design a website maintainer that does that. I'm going to focus on API docs and user docs. I don't know. I'm like where.
Well,
where,
I think
where do you draw the line?
I mean. That's kind of the struggle, right? Because documentation means something different to a lot of different people too. Like I usually have a website in my head currently, but you just pulled out a manual, right? And that is what's in somebody else's mind is something different, right? And then, last time I bought a camera, they offered me free classes, right? So then there's the whole training aspect. Maybe you're going to go make videos. And so, I think that you have to listen to your users. You have to figure out where they are. And I think that happens a lot, in developer communities. Where are they already? What do they prefer? I mean, my kid learned Minecraft on videos. I hate watching videos to learn anything, And so it really is about, okay, who's your audience? What are they trying to get into? And then you probably have to tailor it to them and, figure out what they need. So anyway, because documentation is so broad, don't limit yourself. Figure out what your users need and then find a way to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of like documentation, like technical documentation for software, like if you take that as a really strict definition, I think it's about what you're describing are like expanding spheres of influence, really. And I think like the core sphere there is the product 100% documented? Yes or no? And if your core product is not 100% documented, stop there. That's where you stop yourself. That's the baseline. You have to document it. It has to be documented accurately. It needs to be updated with every release. When you've sort of satisfied that core requirement, well, then you can expand outwards and say, well, there's training that needs to be done. We need to write case studies. If you're an open source, it's like, have we documented our community engagement methods? Like one thing that I mention to projects almost every time I do a review with them is, have you actually advertised when your community meetings are? Because if you don't publish your community meetings, you can't expect people to join them. Just really basic things like that. And that's kind of the next sphere of influence as you think about the documentation within the system of the project, right? And then the next sphere of influence is when you get to marketing and sales enablement and to a certain extent DevRel, but I think DevRel is actually the same in that it traverses those spheres of influence, where it's like, how do we market the product? And does that actually correspond down to the truth of the product? Are we communicating the product value effectively based on what you know as a documentation person? And it's like you only get out there when you've satisfied the first 2 rings, and then you're in that 3rd ring of like the product and to a certain extent the company in the world.
Okay.
So that's how I think of it anyways.
And then like when you're thinking about documentation and prioritization, do you focus on jobs people want to do, or do you focus on documenting like interface point by interface?
I mean, I gave a whole talk about this.
You could look at, yeah, do you, you go, yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna find a link to my talk, and we'll put it in the show notes.
I can find a link to your talk while you're responding if you'd like.
You know, I already got it.
Oh, nice.
So
there you go.
I gave a talk at KubeCon, the last KubeCon EU, which is basically the basics of how to document, how to do the documentation, because this is the question that I get asked all the time by 100-odd projects. It's a user-focused look, so you're concerned with the jobs to be done aspect of it for sure. But documentation tends to fall into like 3 broad types of things you might be writing, which is conceptual. What is it? How does it? What is it and why do I care? Task, how do I do it? And reference, okay, I've done it, and now I need to alter one weird little thing that I might be the only person who needs to alter. How do I do it? Where's my like little cheat sheet? So start with jobs to be done, and like start with like what does your user actually care about? Then figure out what categories of things you need to write, and then do the hard task of actually doing the writing.
Okay.
That's the sit your butt in the seat.
It's the sit your butt in the seat, which is truly the most difficult part. I described this to a good friend of mine in the Kubernetes community, and I was like, yeah, like writing's like it's a cool thing to do for work. Like I sit myself down and then I start writing and it's really bad, and then I have to like force myself to continue, and you like puke it out and it's horrible and you hate it, but at least it's on paper. And then at some point you have to like revisit it and reread everything you wrote and make it make sense. And I was like, it's fine. Like it's a great job for people who are self-deprecating. But yeah, it's incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult. So
I know I'm gonna hate this. I gotta write it down.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Oh no, 100%.
Yeah.
Like it's just a pure exercise in self-loathing.
Okay. So like in terms of like understanding behaviors and like the jobs to be done, do you prefer doing editing of what other people have written then? I mean, that sounds like what you're saying, Celeste.
It depends. It depends. Sometimes it's easier to start from scratch. Sometimes it's easier to edit. And there are pros and cons to both of those, I think. Okay. Do you want to add anything, Ed?
So I've been playing around with a lot more like kind of, natural language processing, and God, I love those as editors. It's just like, it's going to catch stuff I never caught, give me that any day. I think I find him kind of very tedious. But I guess I'd also rather write. I'd rather poke around with something and write. But one thing I was thinking is like the season of docs, where people can go find a project that needs help with documentation, started by Google, right? And I was actually going through. So I serve on a board at Austin Community College, and they have a TechCom certificate, right? And part of what we as like this board bring is what do people need to learn in technical writing today. And I was looking through that list of open source projects because I feel like that, like I said, that's the future. That's where people are experimenting and doing what's happening now in technical writing. And there was quite a variety of projects. Some were video. That surprised me a little bit. Some of it was, we have a bug backlog, help with this. But there were also really innovative, projects, and a lot of them were docs as code as the tool chain, right? Which was also what I was trying to prove to this board. But it just, it just goes to show you that any individual open source project might have a different need at any given time and their maturity. where their project is. And that meta documentation idea of like, document how you work on this. Any newcomer is going to have the freshest eyes. They're going to recognize the things like, I don't even know where to join your meetings. That's gold. You're only that new VI for a while, like 2 weeks, maybe. I don't know. But yeah, harness that when you have that fresh perspective.
I like a line a colleague said is, your newest users are the people who are experiencing everything you've already forgotten.
Absolutely.
Who know everything you've already forgotten. So let's talk about those soft skills that we were talking about earlier. So one of the things that what's his name? David. I should remember this. David Eves wrote about the Mozilla community is at the time is that open source communities value this technical expertise above all, and yet if you look at the most successful open source contributors, they're the people who have the soft skills, the project management skills, the interpersonal relationship skills, the conflict resolution skills, the negotiation skills. That the soft skills are what differentiates between success and non-success. And Celeste, you were saying that there is a tech primacy in the open kind of culture in open source, and yet I feel like it's been evolving. Do you both agree? And what are some of the things that you look for in technical documentation that are beyond just good writing?
I mean, that conflict resolution piece that you came up with is so key, because when you really think about it, open source uses the worst possible communication tools for actually understanding other people, and the ones which will introduce the most unintentional conflict. So GitHub comments, like how easy is it to interpret GitHub comments poorly? How easy is it to leave a GitHub comment which is like kind of mean, kind of short, kind of rude? I work on the code of conduct committee for the Kubernetes project as well, so like I'm bringing a bit of a different lens to this. But it's the same with Slack. Like how easy is it to misinterpret somebody's Slack messages, right? So I think being able to healthily receive something that's like a little bit short, when like somebody being a bit short with you and say like, hey, we don't talk to people like that in this project, that comes across as a little rude, but the thing you said was valid and here's how we can maybe work through it, is like super key. Documentation it's a team sport, and B, it is all writing is a matter of opinion on some level, and if you are writing in documentation out in the open, you are going to come across people who have different opinions than you, and there will be no resolution. So the other thing that's key is sort of having a hard-coded governance way of resolving conflicts of opinion, but also having the maturity to navigate that without like table flipping is really important.
Yeah, and I think just that there's just a lot of like calm ability to just kind of approach everything with curiosity and not reaction, I think, is probably a really good trait to have, especially in open source. I always look for someone who just wants to learn anything, right? I mean, that's just such a good trait in a technical writer, full stop. Just learn anything, learn it quickly, write it down, and that's just super, super valuable. And that is curiosity as well. So, there's sort of the curiosity of, well, do they really mean to sound rude, or, or even just getting curious, like, why did that make me so angry? I want to reach through my screen, getting curious about yourself too. Yeah. That's a long journey. I mean, but it is that skill set of just, am I managing my own emotion? Am I trying to figure out someone else's perspective, and then having good judgment on what my next action is? And
does that aspect of like there being so many potential skills to learn or to bring to bear in a documentation role, does that contribute to like people having trouble pigeonholing you and figuring out what career you're in? Or you were saying there's not a kind of an obvious career path. So I imagine that like community managers, I've been a community manager for a long time, and like community managers, you've got community managers and developer relations and documentation all kind of end up kind of, what do you do again?
Yeah, totally. 100%. I think, where I think a lot of people in documentation maybe struggle with that open source skill set of, again, just consensus building and sort of relationship management and managing decisions in non-authoritative ways, really. Where I actually think there's a struggle for technical writers is a lot of technical writers are fairly introverted people. They choose writing as a career path for a reason. And I think it takes, at least that's something that I've noticed as I've sort of hired for the team that I'm on, it takes a very specific kind of personality to succeed in open source, and not all writers have it. You have to be pretty personable. You have to be willing to have the conversation. I think a lot of writers can develop it. I think there are maybe a lot of writers who are like looking for a path to something more than what they're doing right now. But like, again, technical writing is a bit of an odd career choice in that regards too. So.
How about you, Anne, in your career? Have you seen people having difficulty kind of placing you in a role because you've come from this technical writing as a background? Or have you seen that as an asset that you've kind of been able to navigate because you've brought so many skills to bear?
Well, I was going to say, ask 5 technical writers how they got into technical writing, and you'll get very different interesting answers. Right? I had a technical writer working for me who had, basically been a navigator on a yacht for like 6 months. Like, you'll get everything. It's really, it's just very interesting career paths. And I think that's, just part of the exploration, and I'll learn anything and, become good at something, right? Become an expert is really important.
Okay. So just to finish up, I'm interested whether you see, both of you, a trend in the open source world towards evaluating, like putting more focus, putting more emphasis on documentation. Whether it's been have you seen things change over the last decade in terms of the attitude of companies who are investing in open source and the people who are hiring for open source projects, whether they're more likely now to invest in technical documentation and hire somebody for a role like that than they were a decade ago?
I know it's a focus for the CNCF, and I think it's become an increasing focus for the CNCF. And I know that, frankly, the CNCF is a bit of a gravitational well for open source these days in particular. So I'd like to think it's going to start becoming a bit more of a trend. I think there's a lot of companies investing very heavily in DevRel, particularly if they're in dev tooling. And I think that also influences greatly the value of documentation, particularly in dev tooling focused companies. So I think there's a bit of a shift happening.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what I've seen in open source is moving towards the foundation, and then that, lets it be a centralized service. And then you are spreading the good practice, spreading the best, why it matters, why good documentation is going to get you somewhere, right? But I also really agree with the DevRel thing. Like, the developer world really, really leans on open source, and that's an aspect that they desire in anything they use, right? And so I think that is going to lend itself, really well. Weaponize the documentation, right? I mean, you don't have to use all military, but it is a way to just make your developer experience stand out. If you have a pretty, and it really is, the product is the docs.
Okay.
Yep. Yep.
So would you both agree then that kind of documentation is a key differentiator? That, like, I said it as a statement, as a kind of a statement of fact at the start, but is good documentation a requirement for success?
I once had a partner who said, and he was a solutions architect, so he implemented things for customers. I once had a partner who said, if I am choosing an open source project and the open source project's documentation is a GitHub README, I will not choose the project. I don't care if it's the best tool for the job. I don't care if it does everything I need it to do. I don't care if it's updated every 2 hours. I can't put that in front of clients. That's not professional. That's not what somebody who's paying hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to implement something wants. And So yes, I think it is. I think professional grade documentation is a huge differentiator.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you both for joining me today. This has been brilliant. I'm still catching up from Open Source Summit in Seattle. I have a couple of highlight videos that I'm working on, and I have an interview that I did with Angela Brown on the importance of events for open source
Nice.
communities. As
Angela's
started to get back
delightful.
into, yeah, she was. And as we're getting back into in-person events, it's like it's really kind of striking how much people have missed seeing each other, but also how exhausting it is to go back to it after a year and a half.
I bet.
So I'm looking forward to that. That's my next couple of sessions on open source and business. So thank you both for joining me today. I'll be getting this up on YouTube shortly.
Okay.
And I hope to see you both soon.
All right.
Oh, thanks
Thank
so
you so
much.
much for having us.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yeah.
My pleasure.
All right. Have a good night or afternoon. Have a good afternoon.
Bye.